all of the things that our culture tells us are wrong about our bodies and all of the things that we experience as doors that close us off to our body are actually the doorways in. These are actually the prophetic messages that our bodies give us about how to heal, about how to be connected, about what is true about us, about what's wrong about the cultural stories. And instead of listening to our bodies telling the truth, we see our body as the scapegoat. We dismiss and disconnect from our body.
Welcome to Mind, Body, Spirit, Food. I'm your host, Nikki Sizemore, and in this podcast, we explore the rituals, traditions, and cultural influences around food and how food connects us and also sometimes disconnects us to our minds, our bodies, our spirits, the earth, and our communities. This is a space dedicated to bringing more presence, ease, and joy into the process of feeding ourselves. Let's dive in. Hello, my friends, and welcome back to the show, and Happy New Year. I'm so happy you're here. And oh my gosh, I have the most incredible episode for you today. And honestly, the timing for this episode could not be better as we kick off the new year and kind of hold ourselves strong for all that is coming this month. I speak with psychologist Dr. Hillary McBride, who is the author of the best-selling book, and honestly, you guys, one of my favorite books of all time, The Wisdom of Your Body, Finding Wholeness, Healing, and Connection Through Embodied Living, and more recently, her book, Practices for Embodied Living. Her new book, Holy Hurt, Understanding and Healing from Spiritual Trauma, comes out in April of this year. There is so much in this episode. I don't really know where to start, but I do want to say that no matter what kind of relationship you've had to your body in the past or how you feel about your body right now, you're going to walk away from today's show with so much more compassion for yourself and a deeper sense of empowerment. Through sharing her own story, Hillary describes how our bodies can support us in expressing who we are, expressing our identities, in feeling whole, in turning towards what's hard in our lives and in tolerating it, and in remembering our own innate goodness. We talk about what it means to be embodied and how we become disembodied. Hillary also talks about the importance of agency, or our ability to be the author of our own lives, and how that relates to empowerment and power in general. And definitely stay tuned for the full episode because she offers powerful tips and tools for connecting to our bodies, helping us to regain our sovereignty, reclaim our pleasure, and celebrate our desires. Just as a trigger warning, Hillary does talk about the eating disorder that she experienced when she was younger near the start of the episode. That experience, however, led her to the incredible work that she does today as a psychologist and writer and educator. These journeys of ours are so important. I think what I'm trying to say is that even the hardest experiences in our lives can point us in the direction that we're meant to go. Sometimes it's those hard experiences that teach us what we're meant to do here on this earth. So I just wanted to remind you of that and say thank you again for listening. I hope that you love this episode as much as I did. Just as a reminder, if you find this work helpful, please support it. This is an ad-free podcast, and it takes a village. It takes a community. It takes you all to make it happen. You can share about the podcast. You can rate it. You can leave comments. You can like it on Substack. All these little things add up. And if you're able, you can become a paid subscriber to the Mind, Body, Spirit, Food newsletter. In doing so, you support this whole project. And you receive weekly newsletters with brand new recipes, all of which just happen to be gluten-free. You get bonus content. You get access to the full recipe archive, which features over 100 recipes. And you get discounts on my one-on-one sessions where I work with clients to help them uncover the blocks and challenges that they're having around cooking and eating. We tap into their intuition. We uncover their unique digestion. And they're just really fun, powerful sessions. So if that calls to you, I'll include a link for that. But without further ado, let's get into this show. Happy New Year, my friends. Hillary, I want to say welcome to the show. It is beyond an honor for me to have you on.
Thank you so much. Oh, I feel that when you say that. That was so moving.
I just got teary-eyed. And I have to tell you, The Wisdom of Your Body, I read it in 2021 when it came out. And I don't know how I heard about this book. I am getting so emotional. So like so many other women, I had a big chunk of my life where I was very disembodied. And I thought I had healed that. And the amazing thing about your book in reading it is I got to go deeper. And what I felt like it did for me was just open this well of compassion. More than anything else, it connected so many dots that I couldn't see just from my own narrow perception. And within that, it was just like a hug to myself. It's kind of like, I'm not alone. And of course, honey, of course you felt that way. And so I just want to say thank you. I admire your work so, so much. And it's such a joy to have you here.
Thank you for having me. And also thank you for reading it and letting it touch you. There's something about writing and releasing a book into the world where there's the writing process, but there's the thing that I think we all want when we write something is for it to land in people in a way that it does something in them, like book as pathway to connection, book as like connection between us, but also you and yourself. And so that to me just feels like, so satisfying, like exactly what I hoped would happen when I wrote it.
Well, I'm going to start by asking you the first question that I ask all of my guests so we can get to know you a little bit. And that is, what is your cultural upbringing and how has that influenced your relationship to food?
So I've grown up as first-generation Canadian on one side of my family, immigrants from Germany who settled in the prairies in Canada just after and around wartime. And as I've been peeling back the layers of cultural identity, what I've understood about farming culture in the prairies and immigrant culture, and also immigrant from wartime Europe, is that there was a lot of intensity that was living in people's bodies. There was a lot of drive, work. And maybe even, as I've been exploring this with my dad a little bit more, work in the field, because then you don't have to show people that you're an immigrant and you can hide that people are perceiving you as the enemy. So the ability for people, I think, in my family to own their culture and to really embody what that meant as they moved and immigrated to Canada was a threat. It was a threat. And I think as I've been exploring that, I've been aware of how that whole part of my family history has translated in some ways into this kind of like nose to the ground, work really hard, and maybe even like hide some parts of yourself, fragment some parts of yourself. The other non-trauma elements of that I think about as it relates to German culture and prairie culture and farming culture is like so much richness around food as an expression of community and connection, which I think is not unique to my family culture. But the ability to sit around a meal and express love and nurturing through extending carefully made recipes and, family history recipes. And I remember growing up visiting my grandma, and she had such a hard time in English saying like, I love you. And not just linguistically, but also I think to be with the emotion of that. But she would save food for us before we came. Now, because we lived in a different province, my parents had moved out of the prairies to the West Coast. Sometimes that meant she'd save food for a really long time. And then there would be this whole piece around like, and now we have to eat the food. And we're like, this is not no longer food safe. I think just all the things that go into how our family was working really hard to stay connected to each other, but didn't always know how to use other ways of doing that. So food or behavior instead of words. And I can see now from a bird's eye view how food started to get complicated or was used in a particular way. Yeah.
How did that trickle down into your lived experience as you grew older?
Kind of the reason why I've been pulling on these threads is because later in my life, I developed an eating disorder in my teen years, and I can see the roots of it brewing earlier. And I have some suspicion about that being connected to family experiences, as well as emotion and what it means to tolerate intensity in my body and to be a sensitive being who feels things deeply in a world that doesn't always know how to be with that. And so there's all of those pieces that I'll kind of gloss over now. But the eating disorder for me, I mean, really took over my life for a certain amount of time. And for anyone who's studied eating disorders or lived through them knows that like food is the thing on top of the other thing. And so the food is the thing that gets the attention, and it gets the control, and it gets the energy, and it gets the family narrative, and it gets the, I mean, all of the things on the surface. And yet there are all of these other things living under the surface that are working themselves out through the eating and the not eating and the kind of the management of that. So I had an eating disorder for a long time, a lot longer than I think maybe even some people knew, because I could kind of, after I got out of treatment, it could kind of fly under the radar for a while. And then there was this season of realizing I want more for myself, and I'm no longer experiencing symptoms of an eating disorder. I no longer have disordered eating, but I have no idea how to be in my body. I have no idea how to actually connect with pleasure, aliveness, joy, pain, emotion, expression, like even attuning, basic stuff like attuning to my bodily cues. Like, whoa, that had gotten so far off my radar. Yeah. And so there's been this interesting journey of being symptom-free for a very long time now, like really thinking about my eating disorder stuff. It feels like so far in the distant past, but actually being connected to my body in a way that is like an expression of my identity and my wholeness and supports my living and turns me towards what's hard and helps me tolerate it and reminds me of my innate goodness. That way of being my body, that's still new.
There's so much there that I want to tap into, but I first want to get into this idea of embodiment. In your new book, Practices for Embodied Living, you state embodiment doesn't have to be learned, for we are born into it. It only has to be remembered. What does it mean to be embodied?
There's the academic definitions, and then there's the colloquial kind of social definitions. And so I'll use both because I am an academic and a person who lives in the world. So when I'm thinking about embodiment, the academic definitions that come to mind are the lived experience of being a body as we engage with the social world around us. So what that's saying is it's an experience. To be a body is not just a story we have, but to feel into the sensual, material, qualitative elements of being human. There's no other place we can be except as a body. But what it feels like to be a body is shaped by the world around us. It's a dialectic with our culture. I walk into a room and there's people who feel intimidating to me, maybe because I've been told a story that they're more powerful or more valuable, and then my body shrinks, right? There's a dance that's happening. And sometimes we forget about that dance. We think of embodiment solely as an interpersonal endeavor. And so we forget that embodiment is bidirectional. We're always shaping our spaces and we're being shaped by our spaces. And that has messages, I think, that are important for trauma and understanding politics and oppression, and also for understanding liberation and community and identity and belonging and transformation. So there's that piece of embodiment when I think about it from an academic perspective, but culturally, colloquially, kind of the layperson definition that we might use is like, I feel connected to my body and I know how to interpret my body's cues and make use of that to help me live a full and meaningful life. So instead of ignoring my body or treating my body like a thing, my body is a someone. My body is is alive with information and sensation. And that's useful for me and important for all of us.
It's so interesting because I think I knew I was in a body and therefore I felt like I was embodied. And in the sense that there's truth to that, and yet, like you, I was so disconnected from the cues of my body and from the joy, the pleasure, I want to even say like the spiritual nature of myself. How do we get disembodied? That was such the norm. Like it wasn't even, I mean, we're all born embodied. And somewhere within my childhood, and it sounds like within yours, that separation occurred without me being conscious of it. How does that happen?
Yeah. I want to bridge this conversation about the book into this question by saying the underlying thesis of my book, if you've read it and if you've not, I'll just here it is that all of the things that our culture tells us are wrong about our bodies and all of the things that we experience as doors that close us off to our body are actually the doorways in. These are actually the prophetic messages that our bodies give us about how to heal, about how to be connected, about what is true about us, about what's wrong about the cultural stories. And instead of listening to our body as telling the truth, we see our body as the scapegoat. We dismiss and disconnect from our body, and we do that individually and we do that collectively. But when we were looking more from the individual front at what's happening that disconnects us, what the research says is that there's usually three things. And I think we could probably fit most experiences into these three categories. The first category is relationships. We have experiences in relationship where we learn implicitly or explicitly being connected to your body is bad and it will cut you off from connection. You have a kind of knowing, but you can't know what you know and be connected to me. So you have to send that knowing away. And I think that happens on small, tiny little microcosmic levels that are imperceivable, especially based on how our childhood brains code information and the way we make sense of things when we're young. But a really good example of this is if I'm angry and I see that I get shamed by the grown-ups around me for being angry, and shame feels way worse than, anything else that I could experience. I'm going to cut off anger. I'm going to suppress those cues. I'm going to do whatever I can to disconnect from that so that I don't have to be shamed, because I definitely don't want to be shamed. And all of this, the theory that undergirds all of this is that we are so wired for connection as people. We actually need it not just for thriving, we need it for development, we need it for the basics of survival. That if something threatens connection, we're going to do anything we can to get rid of that threat. And unfortunately for many of us, the threat is our own knowing. It is our own sensation. It is our own information about what I don't like, about what I like, about who I am, who I want to be. And I think emotion is a really central feature of this, but I think gender can also be in here. I'm just thinking about the number of times I've heard people talk in therapy about being told, we'll just use the example of girls, cross your legs, don't have your legs open, comport yourself in this particular way, because otherwise you're going to be perceived as dirty. And so the message is inhibit your body, restrict your body, take up less space, hide yourself, hide your freeness, your freedom, hide your expression, hide your loose, soft, open, spread wide body, hide it. And so we have these messages that are shaming that we get in relationships, and we play along because we need to, because it's survival. So there's the relational element. We conclude, and that's the social political. I think that's a really important thing to think about, how often relationships enact these large-scale societal beliefs about what's good and what's bad about bodies. And those will get all filtered down and perpetuated through often parent-child or peer-to-peer experiences. And then I think we have the cognitive. So we have the stories that we tell. And sometimes, again, those stories are handed to us in relationship, and then we just perpetuate them internally. Like often when I'm doing clinical work with people will say, oh, I have this voice in my head that sounds like so-and-so, right? When we actually start to explore like, oh, there's a critical voice that says your body's bad, suck in your stomach, or your body's bad, or like you're weak, work harder. When we go, whose voice is that? Sometimes we can actually tell like that actually belonged to so-and-so. Wow. Like I internalized that and took it on. We call that an introjection in psychotherapy. It's a way that we take on other people's ideas and we rehearse them enough that they feel like they're our own. And then we have the physical. And the physical, I think, can't be missed because we have experiences in our bodies that overwhelm us. Right? These are the traumas. These are the things that feel like completely unbearable. And often for something to be traumatic, we're unsupported in it. We're actually not getting connection through the intensity. We're left alone in the face of overwhelming emotion. And our system flops into this parasympathetic response where there's hopelessness and despair. And that creates this opiate dump. And we get in like an endogenous shut off of the pathway of communication from body to the parts of our brain that are sensing our body. And that really inhibits the interior tracking of and noticing of the body. And when that happens enough or significantly enough, we just don't feel what's going on inside. It just goes away. And that's mediated, you can hear this, like both by physical experiences, but also by the way that they're unsupported relationally. So much of this is all about relationship. And I think disembodiment there's one thing I'll mention about the shut off too, when it comes to relationships and the social piece, is that I think there's a lot of disconnection from the body that is survival of trauma. And I think that there's also a flip side of that, which is when people who have had the most power, who have accrued the most power, have used that strategy, somehow it becomes not deified, but valued as a form of supremacy. And I think that the people in our cultures who have the most power have taken this trauma defense mechanism and valorized it as being an ideal. Oof. And I think we look at androcentric culture, we look at men in power, we look at white people in power, right? We look at like hyper cerebral rationality in the academic world and medicine, kind of like all of these systems of colonization of the body. And we go, wow, that is ideal. And we shape our lives around many of us shape our lives around trying to meet those ideals. And yet those are, like I said, a valorized form of a trauma response that happened so long ago that it's now, as Resmaa Menakem would say, like decontextualized from the trauma, and it just looks like supremacy. But there's actually, there's nobody who is integrated who is that fragmented from their body, even if they say otherwise. I think we have to see the shallowness of that form of power as actually a byproduct of fragmentation, which is why those systems of power hurt people, is because they don't give people in power a chance to be connected to the wholeness of who they are.
Well, this is so powerful to hear because in the US, this is playing out in real time and it feels so visceral. And so to have some sort of understanding is actually helpful because so many of us are just like, I just don't understand how we can be in the same position again with somebody who's getting elected, who seems very fragmented and abusive of power and abusive of bodies. I have this question, and I'm not really sure what it is, but it has to do with empowerment. Because here we have these people in power, and it doesn't feel to me like it's an authentic sort of empowerment. For me, at least, I didn't feel empowered as a human until I was really able to connect to my body. And you write about that in The Wisdom of Your Body as well. Empowerment and embodiment, it's almost like the embodiment piece has to come first. So I guess I want you to talk about that a little bit and maybe just try to connect the dots as to like these people who are in power and yet don't feel like they're embodied. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, totally. So a couple things come to mind. One, like feminist conceptualizations of power are helpful here in recognizing that power over is really, really different than power with or power for.
Ooh, I love that.
Yeah, those are not my theories. So go looking for literature on power with and power for if you're interested in learning more about that. But it really highlights that all kinds of power are not the same, right? That there's a different kind of power when we are controlling of others versus when we're saying, I have the capacity to act on the world in such a way that lifts you into more power. That brings us into a position of being able to share resources and connect and be connected to everything and everyone around us instead of create hierarchies or suppress.
Yeah.
And power, when I think about power, I think about like actually thinking about the definition of the word. Like if you actually look at the root definition of the word and like just even going to look up what does power in the dictionary mean, when we think about it that way, what comes to mind is this potential to act, like the potential for something. So like power, let's think of like a strong muscle is a muscle, and a muscle that has a lot of power has the ability to XYZ kind of launch itself, to move, to contract, and to propel movement. Or I think about power like a power source to a light switch, right? All of that energy is there so that I just have to flip it and it does the thing. So there's like a supply, right? When I think about power, I think about supply. I think about the potential for action and the potential matching the action that might occur. And to me, that has similar qualities to agency. And when I think about agency, right, the idea of being an author, to act on the world, to act on your life in such a way that feels like you can write the story instead of the story being written, which doesn't mean that we dismiss the influence of people around us, but maybe remembering, oh, I have choice, I have capacity, I have resources that are inside of me. All of that brings me back to the body in two ways. The first one is I think about eating disorders and Dr. Neva Paran's conceptualizing eating disorders as disorders of restricted agency.
Oh,
That eating disorders emerge from a sense of agency having been constricted and restricted around the person. And so where does agency get enacted? Through food and through the body, because we have a drive. Some of the literature from my field would say we have a drive for affectance. We have a drive to want to be able to express ourselves in the world and feel like, oh, we get a hand in the game of things. So the ability for us to express ourselves and feel like we have a hand in the game of life is a fundamental human need. And when that's been restricted because we've been disempowered, where does that need go? Well, we often take that out on ourselves. No fault of our own. It's like there's nowhere else for it to go. So there's that side of thing. But then I also think about agency as coming from experiencing our body as full of resource. So a good example of this would be, tracking the way that our body supports us to face the demands of living. Like I was in a meeting last night that felt very tense. There was a lot of conflict in interpersonal dynamics. And I remember feeling into my spine and my hips and feeling like, okay, my body is on the chair and my spine is straight. And no matter what happens, I can actually be upright and planted. And it was not just an idea. It was really the sensory experience of my body rooted and tall that allowed me to feel empowered in that moment.
yeah.
Because I had a sense of knowing my body was holding my capacity to face the conflict, face the challenging situation.
It's so fascinating to hear this idea of agency. And when we don't feel like we have agency in our life, which goes back to that relationship side of the disembodiment, to me, because at least this is just my own experience, I believed wisdom and information came from outside. It didn't come from inside. And so it's like if I think back to all of those threads, that agency never developed into a strong vital habit or core of who I was.
Yeah.
And that's my mission, as my listeners know here, is to help us all gain sovereignty around food specifically, but with the idea that food is just one element of that. It's to gain sovereignty in our lives. I'm wondering if this connects to, because this was really helpful in reading your book, this idea of body as object versus body as subject. And that flip, I would love for you to describe that, because that started to change the dialogue within myself about what this thing was and how I could talk to it and trust it.
Yeah. Maybe I'll take a little detour to comment on something you just said first, which is I have a book coming out in April called Holy Hurt, which is all about spiritual and religious trauma. And that to me feels like such an important conversation to have in this context, where the messages around your body is bad, you can't trust your body, you can't trust yourself, you are dangerous at your core, are messages that are not just implicitly communicated in certain contexts and culture, but they're actually really explicit in certain religious communities. And this is not in any way to say religion itself is bad or dangerous, but I think that we can weaponize good and beautiful things to enact harm on people. And we have to look at the impact that's having on people when our conversations fragment people even more from themselves. And there's a really useful strategy in doing that, because then we can outsource to other people the agency. We can outsource to other people the decision-making responsibility for our lives. And it keeps us disempowered and disconnected from ourselves. So I'm just naming that as a way of saying that they're not just, microcosmic interactions with a caregiver where we're like, oh, my anger is bad, but sometimes actually education systems or athletic systems or religious systems or, I'm thinking about any number of media contexts. Sometimes the story actually is your body is bad, make it go away. And all we've ever done is, believed them. Well, it makes sense if all we've done is believed them that we would feel like our body is bad, like we were actually told to. And so we can stop shaming ourselves for feeling like our body is bad when we were just being good all along and doing exactly what we were told to do. And that to me feels like a very compassionate way of rehumanizing ourselves and understanding the context. So that's my detour. But to your question, when you start to look at where the literature on embodiment showed up in philosophy and psychology, as you said already, embodiment is the substrate of being human. It's been around forever. People of color, indigenous people, like even the queer community, there's so many communities, like little pockets outside of culture at large, which have stayed connected to embodiment as an act of resistance and survival. And then all of a sudden, in 40s and 50s and 60s, we have white French philosophers who are like, I think I discovered embodiment. We're like, well, that's cute. Okay. I'm so glad that you're remembering that it's not just I think, therefore I am. It's also where does the thinking happen? Oh, it happens in a body. So I actually love that philosophy got an embodiment upgrade, but it's really important to remember the larger socio-political context, which is not
absolutely,
oh, philosophers have a moratorium on conceptualizing the human experience. So there's really interesting movement that happened in philosophy, particularly in continental philosophy and existentialism and phenomenology, which started to look at the person as having a place, right? Not just being a mind. And one of the ideas that came out of that, these ideas belong to Merleau-Ponty and Jean-Paul Sartre, but this idea that we are not just a thing, we are a subject also. Right? We are not just an object, we are also a subject. And the way that I bring that into my work is by saying, I think we do a pretty good job of body as object in our culture. And I think that's been really useful for capitalism and commercialism and patriarchy to think of women's bodies as objects, to think of children's bodies as objects, to think of anyone who's different than us as their body as an object that we can judge or abuse or whatnot. But where I think we need to move is to remember the body is subject. The body is the place where living happens, not just a thing that our mind carries around, but actually aliveness itself. I like to say my body is not a something, it's a someone. I have a friend, Jamie Lee Finch, who says your body is a person, right? This idea that bodies are us.
Yeah.
And us, right? All of us deserves to be heard and witnessed and integrated into our life. But if that feels confusing and hard to get to because it's like, it kind of breaks our brain a little bit. We're like, I don't know, what does that mean? How is that different? I like to think about body as object as actually having two different categories, right? We have things in our life that we treasure. Just imagine, someone comes over to your house that you don't know necessarily, and you're just getting to trust. You're not necessarily going to say, hey, can you hold my most valuable piece of jewelry while I go, do whatever? But maybe the people who are closest to you, you'll say, oh, these are my precious things, right? Or maybe another example of that is like our phones. We love our phones and our culture. So what do? We wrap them up with these nice cases so that if they fall, they don't get hurt and don't shatter. Like we treat our treasured things differently than we treat our like not so valuable things. Like how many times have I lost a pen? Like quite literally an infinite number of times in my life. Like I could never count. Like I buy pens all the time. I have one in my purse. I don't know where they're going. Like where am I leaving them? Right. The point is that like we have things that we relate to that we also see as just like that, disposable.
Yeah.
Right. Just like it's not so valuable to me, doesn't require protection. So the shift that I want to suggest is if body as subject is complicated, what if we made the move from body as a replaceable, devalued object to a valued, treasured object, as in a something that, requires maintenance. Gosh, this sounds like, I don't know, maybe a relic from a time gone by, but I'm thinking about some of the, the men in my family who have loved vehicles and would spend out with the waxing of the car and then, the vacuuming, the detailing. You probably have a sense about what my car looks like, given how I'm describing this. It's not like that. But the ability to be like, this matters, right? This thing is like, I need to maintain it. I need to keep it in good working condition because it supports me to have a life that's full. Like we could think about it that way if that feels like a shift that's manageable. But then one move further would be, what if our body was animated with life itself? What if our body was as wise and ancient in its knowing as the earth itself, right? We would never look at the seasons of the earth and say, like, winter has no place, right? We understand winter is necessary for spring and summer. We would never look at the tree and go, why did you fruit? Why did you change shape and expand in size and grow in your rings and your width? Why did you not flourish when you didn't get the right nutrients in your soil, tree? Like we would look at the aliveness of the earth and all of its parts and say, this makes sense. There are systems of understanding this in which the earth in its dysfunction, we can talk about climate change. It's telling a story of what happened. It's telling a story of things that have happened to it. And that's true of our bodies too. So when we start to see our body as subject, we see our body as a someone. It happens to be us, but sometimes that's a little hard, right? That means like, oh, maybe everything that happened to my body also happened to me. And I'm not sure if I want to like really own those traumas happened to me, or that was, that's what it's been like to be me. But when we can think about our body as a someone, even making use of pronouns like she, he, they, to be able to talk to our body as a someone allows us to begin to relate to aliveness in a different way. And then all of a sudden we can pull in things like, well, how do I do friendship? Oh, well, when I do friendship, I spend time with someone. When there's an injury, I had a conflict with a friend a couple of weeks ago, and we spent some time repairing the conflict and talking about our feelings about how we'd misunderstood each other. And we didn't just drop the connection altogether. We worked it through. And that's kind of what's happening in our bodies is we're like, oh, I missed you. Oh, you were trying to tell me that you were hurting and I pushed you anyway. Oh, can you tell me what that was like for you? I want to know. Oh, I'm sorry. I don't want to do that again. Thanks for telling me, right? Like the things that we do in relationship with others, we can do with our body, but it requires us to see our bodies as someone who's deserving of relationship.
That's so helpful and powerful. And one thing that I'm curious about is tools that you might have. So I have a practice that I call intentional cooking. And it's a practice. Again, we're so many, connection is like this thing that keeps coming to my mind. And it comes forth in so many of these podcast conversations. But for me, intentional cooking, the practice is to start by taking 2 deep grounding breaths. And it's literally just to come into our body because, my listeners know I went through many years of just like flinging pans around my kitchen, and it was stressful. And I would carry that heightened nervous system all the way to the table where I had indigestion for 5 years. And I guess the question is, what are the tools? If simple tools, I think breath might be one of them, to help us reform that connection. I think using the pronouns is so valuable. If we start that, what else can we do to start to regain that connection to self?
I'll plug practices for embodied living here because there's a whole book full of ideas. So go there for more things, but I'll give you some of my favorites. I think sensing from the inside, we call this interoception. Everything from hunger and fullness and temperature and our own heart rate is in here. But even a simple thing like if we say we have an emotion, asking ourselves, where do I feel that in my body? Or if we're noticing something is like off, where do I feel that in my body? Or even simply, like I would add to your practice, if someone wanted like maybe a next step, take 2 deep breaths and then ask yourself, what's happening inside of me right now? So being able to tune in, right? Check in.
Yeah.
And I think that your comment about the 2 breaths is absolutely essential because we live these lives in which we don't even make space to ask the question of what's happening inside of me. And so we can't ask the question unless we interrupt our rhythms. And the perception often around that is it has to take an hour of yoga. It doesn't.
Right.
It can be the last thing you do before you go to bed or the first thing you do in the morning. Like I've had a practice the last number of years, maybe 10 years now. Hands on my body, one hand on my chest, one hand on my belly. In the morning, I often say, good morning, sweetheart. I'm so excited to spend the day together. And simply holding my body and talking to myself that way. Last thing I do before I go to bed, right? Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. And maybe even remembering like, hey, body, when did we feel the best today? What were the things that made us feel alive or connected? Is there anything that's lingering? Like those moments to tune in and check in, they don't happen if we're not pausing. But then I think the other things, like what the research says is, can you sense your own heart rate? If you can pause and without taking your pulse, if you can sense your heart rate, that's actually a measure of interoceptive ability. And interoception is directly linked to, and this is not surprising here, inoculation against body image messages in the media and more connection to an intuitive knowing.
Yeah.
So we have research to say if you can sense what's happening inside, it's almost like your brain is spending more energy paying attention what's happening inside of you than how is my appearance perceived? How are other people judging me? How am I judging me? And the knowing that connects us to, I don't want to get in that cab, or, ooh, that looks good, or I'm feeling aroused, or I want that thing, or here's my dream, or, oh, I feel so excited. All of that lives in our body. So when we can pay attention to what's happening on the inside, we can get contact with all of those kinds of pieces of knowing about who we are and what we want. So interoception, heart rate. And then I think there's like other kind of fun things like, how do I talk to myself in a moment of struggle in my body? For a while I had a practice. I love to run, and I was like, oh man, this, like when I hit these really challenging moments in my run, like I'm running up a hill and it's kind of at the end of my run and I'm exhausted. How do I talk to myself about that? So do I say like, you piece of crap, get up the hill, you're lazy, or, the worthless, whatever the PE teacher in high school said, or like the football coach. But what if I say to myself like, oh, honey, you're doing great. Let's see if we can do this. Do you want to see if we can make it to the top? Let's go. Right? Like the way I would talk to a girlfriend to be like, do you want to race to the top? Like, let's see. Right? Like make it fun and playful to be like, can I? I wonder. Let's see. And so thinking about the way we talk to ourselves about this, I've got a colleague, Carly Borden, who runs the Public Run Club, and her entire ethos is around intuitive athleticism. Like, how do we engage in movement in a way that connects us to ourselves. And this is a big principle of her work. Like, how do I talk to myself when I'm moving, and what are my values in movement, if not diet culture kind of enacted on my body? And then the last thing I'll say here, I mean, I could just talk endlessly about this. I love it so much, but is movement as expression. So if we're noticing a ton of energy, what if you just like wiggle it out, shake your body, tremor, like move the energy through. What if you're feeling excited and you go, yeah, right? You like let it take up all the space. Or what if you're feeling like, oh, there's an ache in you and you just need a hug? Give yourself a hug, like actually moving the emotion. I do a lot of dance. If you follow me on social media, you'll see that I'm often like, whipping around my kitchen and living room and getting my daughter involved. And we're like moving, doing free movement a lot of the time. And for me, that has been like game changer therapeutic practice to be like, whatever's there, if it's joy, dance can hold it. If it's fury, dance can hold it. If it's longing, sadness, grief, dance can hold it. So I'm doing a lot of movement, and that's easy to do. You put some songs on, you keep cleaning, the hips get going.
So good. Well, it's so interesting that, this sense of interoception and intuition, as I found during my own practice and what I talk about in my newsletter, that sense of intuition, which intentional cooking is like the first micro step towards, is freedom. This is freedom, because now, at least in my own experience, I don't have to rely on the messages of others. I'm not to say that guidance isn't helpful and that I'm not learning, but I can sift through that guidance in a way that is really resonant with my body. And that's such a key to our sovereignty. And then there's also this element of pleasure. Like, can we talk about pleasure for a minute? Because
endlessly, yes.
Here we are in bodies that are animal bodies that are designed to feel pleasure. And yet, for so many of us, we are disconnected from that. And as this episode is airing in January, and I feel like it's like, as one my friends calls it, January is the Super Bowl of diet culture. Like, everyone's trying to be punitive. And it's like, let's just talk about pleasure right now, where I think maybe people need to hear this.
I mean, it's hard to even know where to start because I have so much to say. I'll tease your audience first. I'm currently working on a project related to desire, and I'm calling it wanting right now.
Yes.
And wanting as this core affect, it's like a core thing that bodies do to support our expansion and flourishing. And yet we're so disconnected from it. And I think it's because it's threatening. I think that threatening to people, it's threatening to systems, it's threatening to the structure of our society that really profits on people not knowing what they want and feeling like something outside of them is going to satisfy them, or something outside of them can tell them the truth about what they need. And so, I mean, I just think that there's so much to say here, but wanting as this life force energy that is including our arousal and desire in a sexual sense, but I think it extends so far beyond that into anything that life does to move through us, to cause us to expand. I mean, the same feeling, I would say it's the same thing inside of me when I turned on and like really interested in a sexual experience as when I am turned on creatively. And I'm like, I want to work on that. I want to make that thing. It's like, it's our conceptualization of those as being different, I think does us a disservice, and it keeps our wanting constrained to the sexual realm in a way that I think has made our wanting feel dangerous and threatening, and then inaccessible in other ways. Or maybe we've even assumed our wanting has to be fulfilled all the time for it to be useful for us. And actually, even just the experience of knowing what we want. I think it's Adrienne Rich. I can't remember. Someone will be able to hear this episode and fact check it. But I think like an early feminist writer would say, it's not even that you have what you want, it's that you want what you want. That wanting in itself is fruitful because it connects us to our bodies. It connects us to who we are. It connects us to this like directionality of our life force expression. And I think I've been like teasing this out a little bit over the last little while. And I had some insight as I was working on this project recently that for me, wanting feels like equal parts drive and equal parts surrender. That there is something that is like, it is moving through us.
Yes.
And we let ourselves go into it.
Yes.
And that it's this combination of following that flow that very much has a direction and is taking us somewhere, and it's taking us towards us. It's taking us towards a full expression of ourselves. And we have to let go into it.
Yeah. There's an element here. I'm just like getting chills. Like for me, there's always an element of the unknown in that. There's an element of trusting where this impulse, this want, this desire is taking me without needing to know that there's going to be even an end result. But it's just jumping on that wave and letting the juiciness and that letting that be the thing.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think in many of our modern relationships, especially if we live in this, like the marriage or the relationship story of monogamy, it can be really confusing for us when we have sexual desire for someone else or romantic desire for someone outside of a relationship. And again, I'm thinking here specifically about monogamy, but instead of thinking about that as about that other person or something that has to happen or has to be fulfilled in order for us to get the thing we want, imagining that as this invitation that wakes us up to ourselves, like to experience desire, whatever it's for, isn't even about the thing it's for. It's about, like, it's for us. Like, desire is for us, and it's about us, and it belongs to us. And so our ability to feel our wanting, to feel our desire, doesn't even mean go out and have it all. Right? It's like, oh my gosh, what an evocative thing to connect to the impulse of wanting in a way that helps us know who we are. And there is there is energy around wanting. We would call this eros or the erotic as this is life force energy. I mean, this is the stuff that I think birthed the world. It's like, it's the something that propels everything into fullness. And sometimes the fullness is actually like, we feel so much inside. I can't tolerate it. It's so good and buzzy inside of me. And so, it feels like I'm going to go bananas if I can't have this thing that I want. And also like, wow, what a thing to feel all of that in our bodies.
That's expansion. That's creation. That's how we grow. I could talk to you all day, but I know I have to let you go. And I just want to say thank you so much. I will definitely include links to your books. Is there anywhere else you want to direct people to your work? I definitely want to know your website so that when this new offer comes out, we can send people there.
Yeah. So HillaryLMcBride.com is my website. I'm on Instagram, Threads. Those are like a little bit on Twitter, former Twitter X. But Holy Heart comes out April 15th. I have a new season of Other People's Problems, which is all about psychedelic psychotherapy that's coming out this spring as well. So keep an eye on my channels for that.
Wonderful.
And yeah.
I do have one last question. This is the last question I ask all my guests, and don't worry, it's just an easy one. If it was your last meal on earth right now in this moment, what would it be?
Oh, there's so many things I love to eat. It's hard to say. Okay, it's not really going to hang together in terms of like an aesthetic.
I like it already.
I feel like some kind of taco combined with like maybe a really spicy Thai dish, and then also like cake, and maybe my mom makes this like really amazing pear tart with like a pecan shortbread crust and like cinnamon. I mean, something like that.
I want all of it.
Okay.
That sounds great. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. What a treat to be with you.
Thank you so much for listening. If this work resonates with you in any way, you can support it by leaving a review or comment or sharing it with friends. Also, you can sign up for the newsletter, Mind, Body, Spirit, Food. And by becoming a paid member for just $5 a month, you help fund this entire project. Thank you so much to all of you who are already subscribed, especially to those paid subscribers. This work could not happen without you. I'm Nikki Sizemore, and as always, remember to nourish yourself with intention and love.